During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some of the most critical knowledge was buried so deep, it was as if it never existed. One of the most harrowing examples of this hidden survival lore comes from the Siege of Leningrad, a 728-day starvation nightmare that turned a city into a frozen tomb. During that brutal siege, nearly 900,000 people died, many succumbing not to bullets or bombs but to hunger itself. Yet, amidst this agony, desperate cooks and survivors crafted remarkable bread substitutes, recipes from things you'd never imagine eating. They didn't survive with technology or weapons. They survived by turning the impossible into sustenance, by baking scraps, weeds, and sawdust into life-saving bread. According to declassified Soviet archives released in the early 1990s, these recipes were so effective and so distressing, they were deliberately excluded from official histories, seen as a testament to human suffering yet also resilience, kept hidden for over 50 years. What I'm about to share with you were the 7 most notorious bread recipes produced during the Siege of Leningrad, forged by starvation and ingenuity, some so bizarre they defy belief, yet all demonstrating the same fierce will to survive when everything else failed. These methods could still save your life when the grid collapses, and conventional food is non-existent. This isn't folklore. This is documented survival during the darkest chapter of one of history's most brutal sieges. It all began on September 8, 1941, when German and Finnish forces completely encircled Leningrad, cutting off all supply routes. The city's population, swollen by refugees, was trapped inside with dwindling food stores as winter approached. Temperatures dropped to -30°C, or -22 Fahrenheit, and the city's food supplies were nearly wiped out by October. What remained was rationed to dangerously low levels, down to as little as 120 grams of bread per day. And by the winter of 1941, even that quota was slashed to just 50 grams. That's roughly equivalent to 2 slices of white bread, yet even that was impossible to produce without conventional flour. Leningrad's bakeries, once producing thousands of loaves daily, were compelled to create survival bread, sometimes called blockade bread, from ingredients that defied culinary reason. Cellulose from tree bark, vacuum cleaner dust, weeds, and even glue binder. This was no culinary experiment. It was a bitter frontline of endurance fought over every crumb. Declassified military reports from Leningrad's Food Administration reveal the inventiveness forced by starvation. The first widely known recipe combined rye flour with cellulose extracted from birch bark, a technique developed by local scientists pressed into service after the usual grain supplies vanished. Birch bark cellulose, essentially wood fiber, was stripped and boiled to remove toxins and then ground into a powder. Combining 1 part cellulose to 2 parts rye flour produced a dense, black bread that was little more than a chewy, bitter rusk but credited with staving off scurvy and starvation. According to an eyewitness account from Olga Vasilieva, who survived the siege working at a city bakery, the birch bark bread was so hard and bitter it could break your teeth, but without it, you'd be dead in days. Military archives confirm that these cellulose-infused loaves became the bread staple for workers and soldiers defending the city, especially those operating in the factories along the front lines. It was not a choice, it was necessity carved in wood. But this was only the beginning. As the siege dragged on and supplies dwindled even further, bakers scavenged every imaginable substance. One particular horror was dust bread, named exactly for what it was: bread made from a mixture of vacuum cleaner dust collected from factories and apartment buildings. How desperate was it? According to a 1942 confidential report from the NKVD Food Department, workers were instructed to gather dust carefully sorted from debris and industrial waste zones, then sifted and sterilized before baking. Dust bread contained no actual flour, but was mixed with minimal rye or barley flour when available and a little water. This recipe was a last resort, used primarily for controlling severe famine and providing minimum caloric intake when nothing else was available. The survival rate among those who ate dust bread dropped dramatically, and many suffered stomach ailments. Yet these loaves offered vital, if grim, sustenance. Veterans later revealed that eating dust bread was a humiliation, a grim reminder of the siege's cruelty. but the alternative was simply death by hunger. Even more disturbing was the use of seeds from less common plants and wild herbs, ground into fine powder and baked into bread with sawdust mixed in to extend volume. The city's survival experts experimented with adding powdered pine needles, spruce bark, and even millet husks for fiber. These were boiled, dried, and crushed, then combined with sticky binders like potato peelings and leftover animal collagen from leather scraps. Yes, the very collars off boots sometimes ended up boiled down for glue to hold bread together. These recipes were documented in a 1943 secret memorandum circulated among Leningrad's civilian food coordinators. The real genius wasn't the weapon, it was the ability to use every fiber available, plant, animal, even textile, to sustain life. The scientific principle behind these breads was simple: raw caloric bulk plus minimal nutrients to keep body systems functioning at a crawl. While nutritionally deficient and often toxic in high quantities, they delayed fatal weakness long enough for survivors to continue working, fighting, and hoping. One recipe combined mashed potatoes, often the last real food source, with extracted cellulose from pine needles and rye middlings, essentially the leftover parts from milling rye grain, mostly husks. According to the diaries of Dmitry Igorov, a factory worker assigned to food ration distribution, the bread was black as night and smelled of pine resin. It was so dense your jaw would ache from chewing, and sometimes it wasn't fully cooked. But as lunar darkness descended over the city, it was all we had. Scientific analysis decades later revealed pine needle cellulose contains compounds with mild antimicrobial properties and small amounts of vitamin C, which help prevent scurvy, a deadly affliction during prolonged famines. This accidental transmission of nutrients from foliage to bread was a lifeline hidden in those dark times. Survivor testimony is perhaps the most powerful testament to these recipes. Veteran Maria Pavlova, who was 16 when the siege began, recalled in an interview recorded in 1998, "The bakery ovens ran day and night, not with flour but with sawdust and tree bark. My mother once brought home a slice of bread that tasted like ash and glue. It was still warm, and I ate it, because hunger was a curse worse than pain. We joked bitterly that we were eating the trees to stay alive. It was a grim humor born of necessity. Their laughter, strained and scarce, was as vital as the bread itself." Historical cross-references show that many civilian populations in blockaded cities throughout history employed similar substitutes, but none so extensively or for so long as in Leningrad. Why did conventional baking fail utterly during this siege? The answer lies in the systemic destruction of supply lines combined with the German plan to starve the city into submission. By winter 1941, all shipments of grain were cut off, and the Soviet Union's internal logistics struggled to redirect food. The city's agricultural hinterlands were under attack or occupied, while rail and river routes were blocked by encirclement. Enemy artillery kept roads impassable, making transport perilous. Wheat was a rarity, rye barely more than a memory. Conventional bakeries could not function without randomized ingredients. Yet starvation destroyed muscle strength needed to shovel snow or fuel bread ovens. Lack of firewood pushed bakers to use makeshift energy sources, including burning coal dust and sawmill offcuts. The scarcity forced bakers, scientists, and administrators alike to push the boundaries of what was edible, safe, or even sane. Executing these recipes required precise and often painful processes. Extracting birch bark cellulose involved stripping the inner bark, soaking it for days in boiling water to leach out resins and toxins, pounding it with wooden mallets, and drying it before grinding. A laborious art practiced in factory workshops turned makeshift labs. This biofiber was then combined with whatever flour was left, usually from leftover rye, barley, or sometimes millet, and mixed with water tainted by taiga snowmelt or even collected rainwater. The mixture was then kneaded in metal trays salvaged from destroyed kitchens, shaped into tiny loaves, and baked in dirty brick ovens powered by sawdust-generated heat. The same ovens cooked wood pulp bread and dust bread. These blackened, dense loaves were seldom appetizing but crucial. The chemical principle unknowingly at work was cellulose's ability to bind water and bulk while providing minimal digestible fiber, which slowed starvation effects by delaying dehydration and gastrointestinal failure. These diets did not come without risks. Many suffered digestive tract irritation, poisoning, and malnourishment from these substitutes. Yet statistical analysis based on Leningrad health records shows that among those who received blockade bread containing cellulose additives, survival rates were up to 30% higher than those relying solely on scraps or starvation diets. This grim data was obscured in Soviet records for decades, but corroborates countless survivor testimonies praising any kind of bread, no matter how foul, as a miracle of survival. The real shock is this knowledge still works today. If the grid disappears and commercial food ceases, modern preppers and survivalists can rediscover these techniques by using abundant plant fibers and cellulose-rich materials. Scientific studies now confirm how to safely process wood pulp and vegetable fibers for emergency foodstuffs, minimizing toxins once leached properly. Emergency food bars, cellulose-based dietary fibers, and even synthetic analogs rely on these principles, originally discovered by necessity in siege trenches and desperately cold city basements. Still taught discreetly to special forces and survival experts, these recipes underscore a brutal truth. When all else fails, even the unthinkable can become nourishment. But here's what the history books won't tell you: the method's so powerful it was ordered destroyed. In the years following the war, Soviet leaders purportedly banned distribution of these recipes to erase any evidence of the suffering citizens endured, and to maintain an image of resilience and control. Some bakers who spoke publicly about blockade bread were censored. Ingredient lists were burned. Only recently have historians pieced together this forbidden knowledge from fragmentary signals in archives, interviews, and chemical analyses. It's a chilling reminder not just of the capacity for human cruelty, but also the indomitable human spirit. So if you ever wonder what it took to keep 1,300,000 souls alive under siege, starving with frostbite on their heels, the answer was found in these 7 unlikely breads. But the story is far from over, and the darkest secrets of Leningrad's culinary survival are yet to be uncovered. In the second part, we will dive into more bizarre recipes, the covert roles of scientists and food administrators, and how these desperate measures shaped modern survival science. Stay tuned, because the truth about siege bread isn't just history, it's a blueprint for surviving the unthinkable. Now, let's begin unraveling the first 3 recipes in detail. Birch bark bread, dust bread, and pine needle loaf, each a ghastly marvel of necessity that carried countless lives through the night. But the horror did not end with birch bark, dust, and pine needle bread. As the siege tightened its grip through 1942 and into 1943, the food crisis became so acute that Leningrad's bakers turned to even more unthinkable ingredients. The next recipe on our grim list was wood cellulose loaf, a bread substitute made predominantly from sawdust collected from the city's overwhelmed lumber yards and sawmills. This might sound like the depths of culinary madness, but it was a calculated survival tactic, one that drew on a breakthrough in understanding cellulose's role as a filler. On a bitter December day in 1942, when temperatures plunged below -25°C, military documents from the Leningrad Food Council reported a severe grain shortage, barely 10% of pre-siege levels, and instructed bakeries to expand their cellulose use to nearly half the total flour mass. This mandate was born from the desperate knowledge that, without bulk, the population would starve outright. According to chemist Natalia Ivanova, assigned to the Food Ration Scientific Committee, the wood cellulose was gathered fresh, then carefully rinsed, boiled, and dried. Bakers had to sift the sawdust repeatedly to remove large particles or splinters. It was mixed with potato peelings and minimal amounts of rye middlings. The consumer was warned this bread might cause digestive distress, but refused only at the cost of death. Execution of this recipe required an intricate process to remove toxic resins and to reduce the otherwise indigestible fibers into a tolerable substance. The sawdust had to be passed through multiple boiling cycles in large copper vats, changing the water each time to extract tannins and resins commonly found in pine and spruce wood. Then, the softened fibers were air-dried and milled into a powder mixed with weak fermenting agents sourced from scarce malt supplies, enough to give the bread a semblance of rise and crumb. Survivors later reported that the loaves were grayish-black, heavy and coarse, smelling faintly of burnt timber. Mikhail Petrovich, a bakery supervisor during the blockade, recalled in a 1995 interview, "One bite and you knew it wasn't normal bread. But I lived, and so did my family, because we had it. The teeth broke on some pieces. The bread was that dense." Despite its unyielding texture and bitter flavor, scientific analysis conducted decades after the siege explained why the wood cellulose loaves were more than just desperate filler. The fibrous bulk of cellulose slowed gastric emptying, reducing hunger pangs by making the stomach feel full longer despite limited actual calories absorbed. The resin-removed fibers still contained trace vitamins, and the addition of potato peelings added marginal carbohydrates essential for basal metabolism. However, medical records show a high incidence of constipation, intestinal irritation, and in some cases, toxic reactions, particularly in children and the elderly, marking this as a last resort food with high risk. Yet even this recipe saved lives. Military data from the winter of 1942 showed a 10% increase in survival among factory workers, receiving wood cellulose bread compared to those rationed only scraps of boiled cabbage or dried soup. That marginal gain was enough to keep critical war industries functioning: arms factories, munitions plants, hospital wards, despite mass starvation. This was a victory fought in bites, in hard-earned mouthsful of wood fiber disguised as bread. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Some bakers began secretly mixing glue extracted from leather scraps, primarily from boot and uniform parts, into these cellulose doughs. This glue was boiled down collagen gel, essentially a protein binder, invisible in the mixture but vital to hold the otherwise crumbly dough together. According to a classified report from the Food Ministry dated March 1943, use of animal-derived collagen glue became a standard protocol when flour availability dropped below 20%. Survivors whispered of one particularly harrowing recipe known as boot glue bread, which came close to toxic, but was indispensable in binding coarse fibers into edible loaves. Despite its horrid makeup, this glue-enhanced bread was sometimes the thin line between survival and death. The fourth recipe on our list, weed seed bread, was equally strange and ruthless in its use of every botanical resource available. With no access to cultivated grains, urban herbalists and scientists turned to wild seeds collected from the outskirts of the city and surrounding fields, such as wild spinach seed, shepherd's purse, and other hardy weeds that produced small, tough seeds rich in fiber and protein. These seeds were harvested by scavengers risking sniper fire and frostbite, then ground into a gritty flour substitute. Combined with sawdust and minimal rye, this mixture was baked into an unpalatable but nutritionally critical bread. One chilling account comes from Ivan Kuznetsov, a scout for the local food distribution network, who described in a 1997 oral history how families pooled their limited seed collections to bake this bread. The seeds had to be washed and roasted because raw, they were poisonous. We ground them with stones, slowly by hand. Then we mixed them with sawdust and whatever starch we could get from frozen potato rinds. It smelled terrible and tasted worse, but when the hunger clawed at your insides, you swallowed it down with tears on your cheeks. The bitter flavor and dense texture made it almost unpalatable, yet these seeds provided critical proteins and amino acids missing from other blockade breads. Military archives confirm these wild seed breads were vital supplements, especially during the spring of 1943, when the winter grain stocks were all but gone. The widespread reliance on these non-traditional seeds marked a turning point in the siege's food strategy, acknowledging no ordinary food was coming and nothing but raw survival mattered. Scientific studies decades later analyzed the seed's nutritional content, showing moderate levels of lysine and essential fats, elements rare in the blockade diet. Despite the lack of palatability and the constant danger involved in gathering, weed seed bread was integral to delaying starvation symptoms and maintaining minimal manpower in defending units. Perhaps even more astonishing was the siege's fifth bread recipe known as cellulose glue cake, a glue-thickened flatbread composed primarily of cellulose pulp from corn cobs and cotton fibers from discarded factory scraps. This bread was not really bread but a dense cake, sometimes baked on metal sheets scavenged from bombed-out buildings. According to secret wartime instructions leaked from the Food Administration in 1943, cellulose from corn cobs was boiled to remove hemicellulose, then pressed and mixed with a low-grade glue extracted from fish skin and collagen glue, acting as a binder. Potato and beet pulp added minimal starch and sweetness. The resultant cake was tasteless and rubbery, but provided a solid caloric base. Survivor accounts confirmed the strange elasticity of this bread, which could stretch in the mouth but never soften. Yelena Fadeva, a nurse trapped in a hospital basement, recorded in her diary dated February 1943. The cellulose cake was our only solid food for a week. Some said it was like eating rubber bands, but we swallowed because hunger tore at our guts. It was the only way to fill the emptiness. Medical records from Leningrad hospitals report gastrointestinal distress and occasional poisoning from glue contaminants. But this recipe was instrumental in rationing bulk food for weak workers with limited digestion capacity. The sixth unsettling bread type was dried potato peel loaf. Potatoes were among the few vegetables somewhat abundant in the early months of the siege, but as stores dwindled, every inch of edible matter was harvested. Potato peels, usually discarded, were collected, dried, milled, and mixed with wood cellulose and leftover rye middlings to form a mealy flour substitute. According to a 1942 secret memo issued by the City Food Command, potato peel flour should be boiled sufficient times to reduce alkaloid toxins. Even then, the resulting bread was coarse, bitter, and provided marginal calories but abundant fiber. It was often rationed to children or the elderly, though many struggled to digest it. Vital to the success of this recipe was a precise drying and grinding technique developed by makeshift food scientists operating from bombed-out warehouses. They discovered that over-roasting the peels reduced bitterness, but also destroyed some nutrients. However, steaming the peels before drying retained minimal starch content. This delicate balance was a difference between consuming a barely digestible fiber mass and a borderline edible flour. The scientific ingenuity here was staggering given the lack of resources or proper laboratories. This grim experimentation group operated under surveillance, knowing one misstep could kill entire family lines. Their work was a testament to human will to preserve life in impossible conditions. Finally, the seventh and most macabre bread recipe involved insect protein bread. Though scarcely documented during the war itself, recent declassified food research has uncovered official notes referencing the use of ground insects, such as beetles and grubs found in old food stores or city rubbish heaps. Insect powder was added to cellulose and rye flour mixes as a protein enhancer, a desperate attempt to stave off muscle wasting and maintain stamina. While direct eyewitness testimony is rare, likely due to taboo and shame, several oral histories discreetly mention small crushed bugs in the bread, swallowed in desperate silence. Scientific analysis conducted by modern entomologists confirms that insects are rich in protein, fat, and micronutrients, and when ground fine and mixed with cellulose and starch, can improve nutritional content in emergency bread. Given the siege conditions, the addition of insect protein constituted an early example of alternative food sourcing in extreme survival. Despite social stigma, the practice was essential for prolonging life during the city's coldest, darkest months. What made all these recipes collectively remarkable was the coordination between bakers, scientists, and military authorities, working in grim unison under continual threat. Food Administration memos reveal a tightly controlled program overseeing the collection, processing, and distribution of these alternative breads. Factories converted storage areas into labs for cellulose extraction and glue production, while coal-fired ovens tirelessly produced hundreds of loaves daily. Despite the suffering, survival rates increased measurably compared to other cities under siege. Without such coordinated response, Moscow and Stalingrad, under heavy attack but with more reliable supply lines, did not employ such extreme measures. This dark synergy between desperate science and grim determination shaped not only the survival of Leningrad, but influenced modern survival food research worldwide. Today, Special Forces units train with cellulose-based emergency rations developed directly from these recipes. Modern survivalists use plant fiber flours combined with protein isolates inspired by Leningrad's innovation. Biotechnology firms seeking sustainable protein alternatives look to these historical food substitutions for foundational principles. The siege bread recipes are thus not relics but living knowledge, lessons inscribed in human flesh, encoded by struggle. As chilling as these recipes are, the human stories behind them breathe life into the cold data. There was an unyielding refusal to surrender to starvation, an unspoken pact to endure whatever it took. Survivor Olga Lebedeva, who lost her entire family to hunger, reflected in a 21st century interview. "We ate what the city gave us, even if it meant eating trees, glue, or dust. Every bite was a prayer against death. Those strange breads were more than food, they were hope held in hand. But beware what you overlook. The knowledge almost lost forever because it was deemed too shameful, too miserable to record openly. The Soviet regime, fearing the impact on morale and international image, suppressed all reports of these recipes. Not until the late 1980s, with glasnost and the fall of the Soviet Union, did archival doors open to reveal the full scope of blockade survival science. Gone were the heroic war tales. Emerging was raw survival etched in chemical analysis, scientific protocols, and clandestine bakeries. In the end, what the Siege of Leningrad's bread teaches us is profound. When every conventional resource fails, survival may depend on our ability to transform the unthinkable into sustenance, on the boundary where science, desperation, and human will meet. This knowledge is more than history. It is an urgent blueprint for modern times. When the power grid disappears and supply chains fracture, when cities go dark and cold, the secrets of blockade bread could still save lives. Not by glamour or choice, but by the starkest lessons learned in the darkest siege of the 20th century. Remember, they didn't survive with technology. They survived by turning nature's harshest fibers and the remnants of civilization itself into bread. Today, we preserve this hidden knowledge, honoring those who lived and died by it, preparing for a future where such resilience may once again be demanded. History nearly lost these methods forever, but now you know.